Eleanor Hayes inherited nothing but debt, a failing farm, and a stubborn donkey named Henry. The town laughed. The powerful Warren Aldridge scoffed. But Eleanor saw possibility where others saw ruin. Could a sick woman and an old donkey change everything? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Eleanor Hayes sat in the cramped office of her father's lawyer, trying to hold back tears. The funeral had been just 3 days ago, and now here she was, about to hear what her beloved father had left behind. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the oxygen tube in her nose. The chronic illness that had plagued her for years seemed to worsen with stress. "Are you sure you're feeling well enough for this, Ms. Hayes?" asked Mr. Peterson, the family lawyer. His round glasses kept sliding down his nose as he shuffled through the papers. "I'm fine," Eleanor said firmly. "Please continue." The lawyer cleared his throat. "Very well. As you know, your father's farm had been struggling for years. The medical bills from your mother's passing left him with considerable debt." Eleanor nodded. She knew all too well about crushing medical bills. After settling all debts and accounts, Mr. Peterson continued, "There isn't much left of the estate except—" He paused, looking uncomfortable. "Except what? Your father left." "His donkey, the one named Henry." Eleanor blinked. "Henry? Just Henry?" "I'm afraid so. The bank has claimed the farmland, the house is being sold to cover remaining debts, but the donkey, well, he's yours if you want him." Eleanor sat back in her chair, feeling dizzy. A donkey. Her father had left her a donkey. The same stubborn animal that used to follow her around the farm when she was little. Just then, a loud laugh echoed from the hallway. Warren Aldridge, the town's richest man and biggest property developer, stood in the doorway. He'd been buying up struggling farms all over the county, including, apparently, her father's. "I couldn't help but overhear," Warren said, his expensive suit making Eleanor feel even more aware of her worn dress. "Her donkey, that's all, how fitting. What can a sick woman possibly do with a worthless animal?" Eleanor felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. Warren had always looked down on her family, especially after she got sick and had to quit her teaching. "Job, Mr. Aldridge, this is a private meeting," Mr. Peterson protested, but Warren was already walking away, his laughter echoing down the hall. Eleanor sat there, fighting back tears, but then something stirred in her memory. Her father's voice, from long ago. "Remember, sweetheart, I've never given you anything useless." She straightened her back, despite the pain. "I'll take Henry," she said firmly. Mr. Peterson looked surprised. "Ms. Hayes, be practical. You can barely afford your apartment. The animal needs food, shelter." I said, "I'll take him." That afternoon, Eleanor stood in what remained of her father's barn, looking at Henry. The old donkey lifted his head and brayed softly, walking over to nuzzle her hand like he used to years ago. "Well, Henry," she whispered, stroking his grey muzzle, "looks like it's just you and me now." Her oxygen tank wheezed slightly as she took a deeper breath. Most people would see this inheritance as a cruel joke. A sick woman and an old donkey. What a pair. But Eleanor remembered how her father used to say that sometimes the biggest blessings come in the strangest packages. She looked around the barn, her mind already working. The bank had claimed the farm, but they hadn't said anything about the old plough in the corner or the cart behind the barn. Both were too old to be worth much, but they still worked. "Dad always said you were the strongest donkey in the county," she told Henry, her voice growing stronger. "Want to help me prove a few people wrong?" Henry's ears perked up, and for the first time since her father's death, Eleanor felt a spark of hope. Warren Aldridge and everyone else might be laughing now, but her father had taught her something. Important. It's not about what you have, it's about what you do with it. She had no money, failing health, and a donkey. But maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start. Little did Eleanor know that this moment, standing in an old barn with a donkey who nobody wanted, would be the beginning of something that would change not just her life, but the entire town. And Warren Aldridge. He wouldn't be laughing for long. The first week with Henry wasn't easy. Eleanor had to move him to old Mrs. Johnson's property on the edge of town. The elderly widow had a small, unused barn and, after hearing Eleanor's story, offered it for almost nothing. "Your father was always kind to me," Mrs. Johnson said, helping Eleanor set up Henry's new home. "He used to plough my vegetable garden every spring, wouldn't take a penny for it." Eleanor smiled, remembering. That was her father, always helping. "Others, even when he had little himself. There's a patch of land behind the barn," Mrs. Johnson continued, pointing. "It's not much, but you're welcome to use it. Shame to see good soil go to waste." Eleanor looked at the overgrown plot. It wasn't big, maybe half an acre, but it was more than she had yesterday. Her mind started working on possibilities. That evening, she sat in her tiny apartment, spreading her bills across the kitchen table. The oxygen tank beside her wheezed steadily as she counted her meager savings. The disability checks barely covered her rent and medications. But she had something now, a donkey, access to land and an old plough she'd managed to salvage from her father's barn. The next morning, Eleanor was at the library, ignoring the whispers and stares as she checked out books on small-scale farming. Her hands shook as she carried them to a table, but her determination was stronger than her weakness. "Look who's trying to be a farmer," a voice sneered. Warren Aldridge's wife, Victoria, stood there in her designer clothes. "Honey, you can barely breathe. How do you expect to work the land?" Eleanor just kept reading. She'd learned long ago that some people weren't worth responding to, but Victoria wasn't done. "Warren says you'll probably end up selling that donkey for glue within a month, though who'd want to buy it?" Eleanor looked up then, meeting Victoria's eyes. "Your husband seems awfully interested in my failure, Mrs. Aldridge. I wonder why that is." Victoria's face reddened and she stormed off. Eleanor went back to her books, but her hands were shaking harder now. Not from illness this time, but from anger. They thought she was weak, useless, just like they thought Henry was worthless. Over the next few weeks, Eleanor and Henry fell into a routine. She'd come early in the morning when the air was cool and her breathing was easier. While other people rushed to office jobs in the city, she and Henry slowly ploughed that small plot of land, one row at a time. "Steady, old friend," she'd encourage him, taking frequent breaks to catch her breath. "We'll show them what we can do." Some days were harder than others. There were mornings when her chest felt too tight, when every breath was a struggle. But Henry seemed to sense when she needed help. He'd work slower on those days, stopping often to check on her. One Sunday afternoon, while Eleanor was planting her first seeds, she overheard two locals walking past. "Poor thing," one said. "Doesn't she know you need more than a half-dead donkey and a patch of dirt to make it in this town?" Eleanor's hands tightened around her seed packets. She might be sick, but she wasn't deaf, and she certainly wasn't dead. Yet, that evening, as she was closing up the barn, Mrs. Johnson came by with a basket of fresh biscuits and an envelope. "Found these in my attic," the older woman said, handing over the envelope. "They're my late husband's notes on companion planting. He was known for growing the best vegetables in the county before the big farms took over." Eleanor opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside were detailed handwritten notes about which plants helped each other grow, how to naturally deter pests, and how to make the most of limited space. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered, clutching the papers. "This means so much." Mrs. Johnson patted her hand. "You know what I see when I look at you and that donkey? I see hope. And this town could use more of that." As Eleanor drove home that night, her oxygen tank in the passenger seat, she thought about hope. Warren Aldridge and his friends might have money and power, but they didn't have what she had: determination, a faithful donkey, and now, a plan. In her small apartment, Eleanor spread Mrs. Johnson's notes on her table and began to work. She might not be able to farm like her father did, but maybe she could do something different, something smaller but special. Little by little, seed by seed, row by row, Eleanor Hayes was about to prove that sometimes the smallest beginnings can lead to the biggest surprises. And in a town that had forgotten the value of simple things, that lesson was long overdue. 2 months had passed since Eleanor started working her small plot of land. The summer sun beat down on her back as she knelt in the dirt, examining her first crop of tomatoes. They were smaller than the ones in the supermarket, but they were perfect. In their own way. "Would you look at that, Henry?" she said, holding up a ripe tomato. The donkey lifted his head from where he was resting in the shade, his ears perking up at her voice. Just then, a fancy car pulled up to Mrs. Johnson's property. Eleanor's heart sank when she saw Warren Aldridge step out, dressed in his usual expensive suit. "Well, well," he said, looking around with a smirk. "I heard rumors you were actually trying to farm, but I had to see it for myself." Eleanor stood up slowly, steadying herself against her oxygen tank. "What do you want, Mr. Aldridge?" "I'm here to make you an offer." He pulled out a checkbook. "This little experiment of yours is amusing, but let's be realistic. You can barely take care of yourself, let alone run a farm. I'll buy the donkey, give you enough to cover a few months' rent. You can rest, focus on your health." Eleanor felt her face grow hot. Henry's not for sale. Warren's friendly facade dropped. "Don't be stupid, Eleanor. Look at yourself. You're out here playing farmer with a half-acre and a donkey while struggling to breathe. It's pathetic." Before Eleanor could respond, Mrs. Johnson's voice rang out from her back porch. "The only pathetic thing I see is a man trying to bully a sick woman." She walked over, her old hands gripping her cane tightly. "Your father would be ashamed, Warren Aldridge." Warren's face darkened. "My father understood business, Mrs. Johnson, something this town seems to have forgotten." He turned back to Eleanor. "The offer stands for now, but it won't last forever. After..." He left. Eleanor's hands were shaking so badly she had to sit down. Mrs. Johnson brought her a glass of water and sat beside her. "Don't let him get to you, dear," the older woman said. "Men like that, they only understand money, but there are more important things in life." Eleanor nodded, but Warren's words had hit home. She was struggling. The small garden was producing vegetables, but it wasn't enough to make a real living. She needed to think bigger, but how? The answer came the next day, and like most good ideas, it started with a problem. Eleanor was trying to figure out how to get her vegetables to the farmer's market in town. She couldn't afford to rent a truck, and her old car wasn't reliable enough. Then she looked at Henry and the old cart they'd saved from her father's farm. "What do you think, boy?" she asked. "Ready for a trip to town?" The next Saturday morning, Eleanor and Henry caused quite a stir at the farmer's market. People stopped to stare at the odd sight, a woman with an oxygen tank, leading a donkey pulling a cart full of fresh vegetables. But then something unexpected happened. An old man picked up one of her tomatoes and smiled. "These remind me of how vegetables used to taste," he said, "before all the big farms took over." A young mother bought a basket of Eleanor's produce. "I love that these are grown right here in town," she said. "My kids can actually see where their food comes from." By the end of the morning, Eleanor had sold everything she'd brought, but more importantly, she'd learned something valuable. People were tired of the same old supermarket produce. They wanted something different, something real. That evening, as she fed Henry his dinner, Eleanor's mind was racing with possibilities. The half-acre behind Mrs. Johnson's barn wasn't much, but maybe she didn't need a huge farm. Maybe what she needed was to think differently. She pulled out Mrs. Johnson's husband's notes again, focusing on one section she'd overlooked before, about intensive growing methods for small spaces. Then she looked at the empty lots in town, the unused backyards, the forgotten spaces. "You know what, Henry?" she said, scratching behind his ears. "Maybe Warren's right. Maybe I can't run a regular farm, but who says that's what we have to do?" She grabbed a notebook and started writing. Warren Aldridge thought she was playing farmer, but Eleanor Hayes was about to rewrite the rules of the game, and her faithful donkey would be right there with her, every step of the way. What Eleanor didn't know was that her small success at the farmer's market had already caught someone's attention. In his office across town, Warren Aldridge was making phone calls, determined to stop whatever Eleanor was planning before it could really begin. The game was about to get a lot more serious, and the stakes were higher than Eleanor could imagine. Eleanor's new plan started small but spread quickly. She went door to door, talking to people with unused backyards. Her offer was simple. She would grow vegetables in their yards and share the harvest with them. Henry would do the plowing, and she would do the planting and maintenance. "But why would you want to use my backyard?" Mrs. Garcia, a retired nurse, asked one afternoon. "Because every little bit of land counts," Eleanor explained, taking a careful breath from her oxygen tank. and together, all these small gardens could add up to something big. Mrs. Garcia looked at her overgrown backyard, then at Eleanor's determined face. "Well, I always did want a garden, but my arthritis." "That's why we work together," Eleanor said. "You provide the space, I provide the work, and we both get fresh vegetables." By the end of the week, Eleanor had agreements with 5 households. Henry would pull the plow from yard to yard, drawing curious onlookers wherever they went. Children would run alongside them, fascinated by the gentle donkey who worked so steadily. But not everyone was happy about Eleanor's growing success. Warren Aldridge called an emergency meeting of the town council. "This is about health and safety," he argued in the crowded meeting room. "We can't have livestock roaming through residential areas. And what about proper permits for farming in residential zones?" Eleanor sat in the back of the room, her oxygen tank beside her, listening as Warren tried to shut down her business before it could really begin. But then, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Garcia stood up. "That donkey and those gardens are the best things to happen to this town in years. My grandchildren actually want to visit now to help in the garden and pet Henry." Others started speaking up too. Mr. Chen talked about how his kids were eating vegetables for the first time without complaint. Mrs. Rodriguez mentioned how the garden had brought her neighborhood together. The council decided to postpone any decisions, much to Warren's obvious frustration. But Eleanor knew this wasn't the end of it. The next morning, she found Henry's barn door spray painted with the words, "Get out." Her hands shook as she tried to clean it off. "Don't worry about that," Mrs. Johnson said, bringing out soap and brushes. "I already called my grandson. He'll repaint the whole barn this weekend." But the harassment didn't stop there. Someone complained to the health department about Eleanor's vegetables. The inspector who came, however, was surprised to find her methods were more organic and safe than most commercial farms. "Actually," the inspector said, looking impressed, "you might want to consider getting organic certification. Your methods already meet most of the requirements." Warren's next move was more direct. He started buying up the empty lots Eleanor had been eyeing for expansion. "Progress," he called it, though the lots remained empty. One evening, as Eleanor was finishing up her rounds, Victoria Aldridge pulled up in her luxury car. "Warren asked me to give you one last chance," Victoria said, holding out an envelope. "There's enough money in here to move to a nice retirement community, medical care included." Eleanor looked at the envelope, then at Henry, who was contentedly munching on grass nearby. "You and your husband still don't understand, do you? This isn't about money." "Then what is it about?" Victoria snapped. "Why are you being so stubborn?" Eleanor smiled. "It's about proving that everyone has value, even a sick woman and an old donkey." Victoria drove away angry, but her visit had given Eleanor an idea. The next day she went to see Betty Wilson, who ran the local nursing home. "I have a proposal," Eleanor said. "Your residents need activities and fresh air. I need help with lighter garden work, like seeding and weeding." "What if we work together?" Betty's eyes lit up. "A therapeutic garden program. Our residents would love that." Within weeks, the nursing home's back lawn was transformed into a thriving garden. Elderly residents who rarely left their rooms were outside daily, working with Eleanor and visiting with Henry. The local paper ran a story about the program, complete with photos of smiling seniors petting Henry and proudly showing off their vegetables. Eleanor kept a copy of the article, though she had to admit the headline was a bit much. "Local woman and donkey bring new life to nursing home." But Warren Aldridge saw the article too, and he was furious. That evening, he made a phone call to an old friend at the bank. "It's time to shut this down," he said. "Find a way." Eleanor had no idea that her biggest challenge was yet to come. As she worked in her gardens, teaching seniors how to plant seeds and children how to harvest vegetables, storm clouds were gathering. Warren Aldridge was about to play his trump card, and this time he was playing for keeps. Eleanor knew something was wrong the moment she saw Mrs. Johnson waiting at the barn door early one morning. The elderly woman's face was pale, and her hands clutched a letter. "The bank," Mrs. Johnson said, her voice shaking. "They're calling in my mortgage. They say I have 30 days to pay in full, or they'll foreclose." Eleanor felt her chest tighten, and not just from her illness. The barn, the garden space, everything she'd built, it all depended on Mrs. Johnson's property. But why? Eleanor asked. You've never missed a payment. They say they're reviewing all their high-risk loans. Mrs. Johnson's eyes filled with tears. I've lived here for 40 years. Eleanor didn't have to guess who was behind this. Warren Aldridge's friend Thomas ran the bank, and this had Warren's fingerprints all over it. As if on cue, a sleek black car pulled up to the property. Warren stepped out looking pleased with himself. Ladies, he said, walking over, I heard about the unfortunate news, but I have a solution. He pulled out a document. I'm willing to buy the property, Mrs. Johnson. Full market value. You could. Get a nice apartment in town. No more worries about maintenance. Mrs. Johnson's hand tightened on her cane. And what about Eleanor's gardens, her business? Warren's smile didn't reach his eyes. I'm sure Miss Hayes understands that business is business. Nothing personal. Eleanor felt dizzy with anger. Nothing personal. You're trying to destroy everything we've built. What you've built, Warren said coldly, is a joke. A few backyard gardens and a petting zoo for seniors. This town needs real development, not your little farming experiment. Just then, Henry let out a loud bray from his stall. The sound made Warren jump, and despite everything, Eleanor had to hide a smile. Think about it, Mrs. Johnson, Warren said, regaining his composure. You have 30 days. He walked back to his car but turned around at the last moment. Oh, and Eleanor? I hear the nursing home is reviewing all their external programs. Liability concerns, you understand. After he left, Eleanor helped Mrs. Johnson to a chair, her own hands shaking as she poured them both glasses of water. He won't stop, Mrs. Johnson said quietly. Not until he's destroyed everything. Eleanor looked out at her gardens, at the neat rows of vegetables that had given so many people hope and purpose. Then she looked at Henry, who was watching her with those wise, gentle eyes. Maybe, Eleanor said slowly, that's because we're making more of a difference than he wants to admit. She spent that evening making phone calls to Mrs. Garcia, to Mr. Chen, to all the families whose backyards she'd transformed, to Betty at the nursing home, to everyone who had become part of her growing community. The next morning, Eleanor was at the local diner when she overheard two businessmen talking. Aldridge is expanding again, one said, buying up half the town for his new development project. Yeah, but have you seen the plans? All luxury condos and high-end shops. Where are regular folks supposed to go? Eleanor's mind started working. She remembered something her father used to say. Sometimes the biggest guys fall the hardest because they never look down at their feet. She went to the library and started researching. Property records, town council minutes, development plans. Her chest hurt from the stress, but she kept going. There had to be something she was missing. That afternoon, as she was checking on the nursing home garden, one of the residents, Mr. Peterson, waved her over. Before he'd retired, he'd been a city planner. I've been thinking about your problem, he said. You know, there are laws about sustainable development and community access, and that friend of yours, Mrs. Johnson. Foreclosure laws protect long-term residents, especially seniors. Eleanor sat down beside him, suddenly very interested. Tell me more. As Mr. Peterson talked, Eleanor took notes. For the first time in days, she felt hope stirring. Warren Aldridge might have money and power, but he'd forgotten something important. He wasn't the only one who could fight back. That evening, as she fed Henry his dinner, Eleanor made a decision. If Warren wanted a fight, she'd give him one. But not his way, her way. With community, with connection, with all the small things that his money couldn't buy. She looked at the letter from the bank, still sitting on Mrs. Johnson's kitchen table. Warren thought he had them cornered. But he was about to learn that sometimes the smallest opponents could be the most dangerous. What Eleanor didn't know was that her fight was about to attract attention far beyond their small town. Sometimes David versus Goliath stories have a way of capturing people's hearts. And in the age of social media, those stories could spread faster than anyone expected. The community center was packed. Eleanor stood at the front of the room, her oxygen tank beside her, looking out at the faces of her neighbors. She'd never seen so many people in one place, all here because of her Facebook post about Warren's plans for the town. I know I'm asking, A lot, Eleanor said, her voice shaky but determined. But this isn't just about my gardens or Mrs. Johnson's property anymore. This is about our town. Mrs. Garcia stood up first. Eleanor's gardens gave my grandchildren a reason to visit me. Now they come 3 times a week. You can't put a price on that. One by one, people started sharing their stories. Mr. Chen talked about how his daughter had won a science fair project based on Eleanor's garden in their backyard. Betty from the nursing home described how their residents' depression rates had dropped since the garden program started. Then Sarah, a young mother, raised her hand. "My son has autism," she said quietly. "The only vegetable he'll eat are the carrots he helps grow in our backyard garden. Eleanor and Henry visiting is the highlight of his week." In the back of the room, a local reporter was taking notes. Eleanor hadn't expected the press to show up, but here they were. "What exactly are you proposing?" the reporter asked. Eleanor took a deep breath, steadying herself. "We want to create a community land trust. If enough people pledge their backyards and contribute small amounts, we can buy Mrs. Johnson's property together. Keep it in community hands forever." "That's ridiculous," came a sharp voice from the door. Warren Aldridge stood there, his face dark with anger. "You need millions to compete with my development plans. You really think you can raise that kind of money selling vegetables?" Eleanor met his gaze. "No, Mr. Aldridge. I think we can do something much more powerful. We can show people a different way." The next morning, Eleanor's story was on the front page of the local paper. Community gardens fight back. David, Goliath, and a donkey named Henry. The reporter had captured everything. The elderly residents finding purpose in gardening, children learning where food comes from, neighbors connecting over shared harvests. But it didn't stop there. Someone shared the article online, and suddenly Eleanor's phone started ringing with calls from bigger newspapers and TV stations. "It's a perfect story," one reporter told her. "The sick woman and her donkey against the big developer. People love this kind of thing." Eleanor wasn't sure how she felt about being called a perfect story, but she knew they needed the attention. Warren might have money, but they had something else: heart. And in the age of social media, that could be just as powerful. A local teenager, Jenny, set up a GoFundMe page for the Community Land Trust. "We should make a video," she suggested. "Show people what we're fighting for." The video was simple. Just Henry pulling his cart through town, stopping at different gardens while people shared their stories. Eleanor's labored breathing could be heard as she narrated, which she'd been self-conscious about, but Jenny insisted on keeping it. "It's real," Jenny said. "That's what people connect with." The video went viral. Donations started coming in from all over the country. Some were large, from environmental groups and community development organizations. But most were small. $5 here, $10 there, each with a message of support. "My grandmother had a garden like this. We need more communities like yours." "Don't give up." Warren's response was swift. He held a press conference. Announcing his development would include a state-of-the-art community garden space in its plans. "But it won't be the same," Mrs. Johnson said when she heard. "You can't manufacture community in a fancy raised bed." The nursing home residents organized a letter-writing campaign to the bank. Mr. Peterson, the retired city planner, helped Eleanor file official complaints about the suspicious timing of Mrs. Johnson's mortgage review. Even Henry seemed to understand the stakes. He worked harder than ever, pulling his cart from garden to garden, becoming a local celebrity in his own right. Children would run alongside him, offering carrots and pats. One evening, as Eleanor was finishing her rounds, she found Victoria Aldridge waiting by Mrs. Johnson's gate. "Warren's furious," Victoria said, looking uncomfortable. "He says you're making him look like a monster." Eleanor adjusted her oxygen tube. "I'm not making him look like anything. His actions speak for themselves." Victoria hesitated. "He's not used to losing. Be careful, Eleanor. He's planning something big." As Victoria drove away, Eleanor felt a chill despite the warm evening. She looked at Henry, who nudged her shoulder gently. "I know, boy," she whispered. "We've come too far to back down now." What Eleanor didn't know was that Warren's next move would force her to make the hardest decision of her life. Sometimes winning meant being willing to lose everything. And Eleanor was about to learn just how much she was willing to risk for what she believed in. The headline in the morning paper hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Local gardens linked to health crisis. Below was a picture of her vegetables, looking somehow sinister in the harsh lighting. Warren had found his angle. Someone had gotten sick after eating produce from one of Eleanor's gardens, and he was making sure everyone knew about it. "But that's impossible," Eleanor protested at the emergency town council meeting. "We follow all the safety guidelines. Everything is organic." "The fact remains," Warren said smoothly, standing at the podium, "that we have a sick child. Can we really risk our children's health for this experiment?" Eleanor felt like she couldn't breathe, and this time it wasn't just her illness. The mother of the sick child was there, tears in her eyes, describing her son's food poisoning. "All test results from Ms. Hayes's gardens have come back clean," the health inspector announced. The child's illness could have come from anywhere, but the damage was done. Warren had planted the seed of doubt, and it was growing faster than any of Eleanor's vegetables. The next day, 3 families asked to have their backyard gardens removed. The nursing home board called an emergency meeting to discuss their garden program. The local grocery store pulled Eleanor's produce from their shelves, pending further investigation. Eleanor sat in Henry's barn that evening, her chest tight with anxiety. The donkey sensed her distress and rested his head gently on her shoulder. "What do we do now, old friend?" she whispered. That's when Mrs. Johnson burst in, waving a piece of paper. "Eleanor, you need to see this." It was a medical report. The sick child had actually gotten food poisoning from a contaminated burger at a fast food restaurant owned by one of Warren's subsidiaries. The mother had confused the dates when reporting her son's illness, but before Eleanor could feel relief, Mrs. Johnson handed her another paper. This one made her blood run cold. "He's buying the nursing home, Mrs." Johnson said quietly. "Warren's company is taking over all the senior care facilities in the county. They're calling it modernization." Eleanor understood immediately what this meant. Warren would have the power to shut down her garden program, cutting off not just a major part of her business, but also the community she'd built with the residents. She tried to stand up but felt dizzy. Her oxygen tank hissed as she took quick, shallow breaths. "Eleanor," Mrs. Johnson's voice sounded worried. "Should I call an ambulance?" "No," Eleanor managed to say. "I just need a minute." But she didn't get a minute. Victoria Aldridge walked into the barn looking more troubled than Eleanor had ever seen her. "Warren sent me with his final offer," Victoria said, but her usual arrogance was missing. "He'll clear your name about the food poisoning. He'll even let you keep a small garden at the nursing home. All you have to do is publicly support his development plan and sell him your story rights." "Story rights?" Eleanor asked, confused. "Haven't you heard? 3 production companies are interested in making a movie about you. The sick woman and her donkey who fought big development." Victoria's laugh was bitter. "Warren wants to control the narrative." Eleanor looked around the barn, at Henry, at Mrs. Johnson, at all she'd built from nothing but hope and determination. "If I say no, then Warren releases documents suggesting you knew about contamination risks, but hid them. He has friends at the health department willing to back him up." Victoria paused. "It would destroy everything you've built." Eleanor's chest felt like it was being crushed. She looked at Henry, remembering that day in the lawyer's office when everyone thought her father had left her nothing of value. "How long do I have to decide?" "Until tomorrow morning," Victoria said. "Warren's holding a press conference at noon. Either you're there supporting him or—" She left the threat unfinished. After Victoria left, Mrs. Johnson tried to comfort Eleanor, but there wasn't much to say. This was Eleanor's decision to make. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She drove to her father's old farm, now owned by Warren's company. In the moonlight, she could still see the paths where she and Henry had first started working together. Her father's voice seemed to whisper on the wind. "Sometimes the biggest blessings come in the strangest packages." Eleanor touched her oxygen tank, feeling its familiar weight. She'd been sick for so long everyone thought she was weak. Warren thought she would break under pressure, but as she drove home, a plan began forming in her mind. Warren Aldridge was about to learn that sometimes the people you think are weakest turn out to be the strongest of all. She just hoped she had the strength to see it through. Warren Aldridge's press conference was set for noon, but Eleanor was up before dawn. Her hands shook as she hooked up her oxygen tank, but her mind was clear. She knew exactly what she had to do. "You're going to do what?" Mrs. Johnson asked when Eleanor told her the plan. "Eleanor, that's crazy, your health." "My health has always been bad," Eleanor said, checking Henry's harness, "but that hasn't stopped me yet." By 10 o'clock, word had spread through town. The nursing home residents were the first to arrive at Mrs. Johnson's property, many in wheelchairs pushed by their families. Then came the families whose backyards Eleanor had transformed into gardens. Local reporters showed up, sensing something big was about to happen. At 11, Eleanor led Henry out of his barn. The old donkey was dressed in his best harness, the one Eleanor's father had used for special occasions. She had attached a small cart behind him, filled with baskets of fresh vegetables. "Are you sure about this?" Betty from the nursing home asked. "Warren's lawyers." "Can't stop the truth," Eleanor finished. She turned to the crowd. "Is everyone ready?" The crowd nodded. Many were carrying signs. "Save our gardens" and "Community over profit." Some had brought their own vegetables from Eleanor's gardens. At 11:30, they began their march toward Town Hall. Eleanor and Henry led the way, moving slowly but steadily. The nursing home residents followed in their wheelchairs, then the families, the children, and other supporters. Someone started, singing "This Little Light of Mine," and others joined in. Warren was already at Town Hall doing a pre-press conference interview when he heard the commotion. His face darkened as he saw the crowd approaching. "What is this?" he demanded, as Eleanor and Henry came to a stop right in front of the Town Hall steps. Eleanor's chest was burning from the exertion, but her voice was strong. "This, Mr. Aldridge, is what community looks like." The TV cameras that had been focused on Warren now turned to Eleanor. She reached into the cart and pulled out a folder. "Before you make any accusations today," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "you should know that we've been keeping records. Every safety inspection, every health certificate, every permit." She handed copies to the reporters. "We also have proof that the food poisoning case you tried to pin on us came from one of your restaurants, and evidence that you tried to blackmail me into supporting your development plan." Warren's face turned red. "You're lying." "No, she's not," said a familiar voice. Victoria Aldridge stepped out of the crowd. "I'm willing to testify about everything. The blackmail, the false accusations, all of it." Warren stared at his wife in shock. "Victoria." "I'm tired, Warren," Victoria said. "Tired of watching you destroy good people for profit." Eleanor pulled another document from her folder. "We also have proof that your development plans violate at least 6 environmental regulations and 3 zoning laws. Mr. Peterson, our retired city planner, was very thorough in his review." The reporters were scribbling frantically. Warren's lawyer was trying to get his attention, but Warren wasn't listening. "You think this changes anything?" he snarled. "I still own half this town." "Actually," Eleanor said, "that's not quite true anymore." She nodded to Jenny, the teenager who had helped with their social media campaign. Jenny held up her phone, showing their GoFundMe page. The number on the screen made Warren's jaw drop. Their campaign had gone viral overnight, attracting donations from across the country. Environmental groups, community organizations, and thousands of ordinary people had contributed. "We have enough to buy Mrs. Johnson's property," Eleanor announced, "and enough to start a proper community land trust. Your development plan isn't the only option anymore." The crowd cheered. Several of Warren's business associates were quietly slipping away, sensing which way the wind was blowing. "You'll regret this," Warren threatened, but his voice lacked conviction. Eleanor just smiled and turned to the cameras. "Would you like to hear about a different vision for our town? One that includes everyone, not just the wealthy?" As Eleanor began to speak, telling their story of community gardens and connection, of seniors teaching children about plants, of neighbors helping neighbors, she saw Warren storm off in his expensive car. But she kept talking, even though her chest hurt and her oxygen tank was running low. Because this wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about showing people there was another way to live, to build community, to make something beautiful from what others thought was worthless. Henry stood steady beside her, just as he had since the beginning. And as Eleanor looked out at the crowd, at Mrs. Johnson's proud smile, At the nursing home, residents holding their signs, at Victoria standing tall without her husband, she knew that no matter what happened next, they had already won something precious. The reporters had questions about the land trust, about their plans for expansion, about Warren's threats. But all Eleanor could think about was how far they'd come from that day in the lawyer's office when everyone thought she'd inherited nothing of value. She patted Henry's neck and whispered, "Thank you, Dad, you were right all along." The morning after Eleanor's confrontation with Warren, the town felt different. People walked a little taller, smiled a little more freely. The fear that had hung over them since Warren started buying up properties was lifting like morning fog. Eleanor woke up in the hospital. Her doctor had insisted on admitting her after the march, worried about the strain on her lungs. "You took quite a risk yesterday," Dr. Martinez said during morning rounds. "But I saw the news, the whole town's talking about it." From her hospital window, Eleanor could see Henry in the hospital's courtyard. Mrs. Johnson had brought him to visit, and now he was surrounded by delighted children from the pediatric ward. "The hospital board is interested in your garden program," Dr. Martinez mentioned casually. "They think it might help with patient recovery." That was just the beginning. As Eleanor recovered her strength, visitors brought news of changes spreading through town like ripples in a pond. The city council had called an emergency session to review Warren's development permits. Victoria Aldridge, now staying with her sister, had provided documents showing how Warren had pressured council members into approving his plans. "He's being investigated for corruption," Mrs. Johnson reported, sitting beside Eleanor's hospital bed. "And that's not all. Remember that health inspector he bribed? They're looking into every development project Warren's done in the last 5 years." But the biggest changes were happening at the ground level. People who had been afraid to speak up before were finding their voices. The nurse's aide who brought Eleanor's medication told her about organizing a community garden at her children's school. The cafeteria worker shared plans for sourcing local produce. Even Eleanor's physical therapist was interested in starting a therapeutic garden program. "It's like you woke something up in people," Betty said during a visit, "something that Warren's money had put to sleep." A week after the confrontation, Eleanor was finally released from the hospital. She arrived home to find her small apartment filled with flowers, cards, and baskets of food. But the biggest surprise was waiting at Mrs. Johnson's property. "We couldn't wait," Jenny explained, leading Eleanor to the barn. Once the land trust paperwork went through, everyone wanted to help. The barn had been completely renovated. New walls, fresh paint, proper lighting. Henry had a comfortable new stall, and there was a small office space with a desk and computer. "For managing the land trust," Mrs. Johnson explained. "We're already getting calls from other towns wanting to know how we did it." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears when she saw the sign above the barn door. "Hayes Community Gardens, where small dreams grow big." But not everything was smooth sailing. Warren might have been under investigation, but he wasn't finished fighting. "He's trying to block our permits for the new gardens," Victoria reported during one of her regular visits. She had become one of Eleanor's strongest supporters. "And he's still got friends in the county offices." Eleanor wasn't worried. "Let him try," she said. "We're not afraid anymore." The nursing home garden was thriving. Now other senior centers were starting similar programs. Eleanor and Henry made regular visits, and the residents had started a blog sharing gardening tips and stories. One morning, Eleanor found Sarah, the young mother whose autistic son loved the garden waiting by the barn. "We've been talking," Sarah said, gesturing to a group of parents standing nearby. "We want to start a program for special needs children, teaching them about growing food, working with Henry. Would you help us?" Eleanor looked at these people who had become more than neighbors. They were partners, friends, community. Even her health seemed better these days, as if purpose and hope were the best medicine. "You know what the best part is?" Mrs. Johnson said one evening as they watched the sunset from her porch. "Money can't buy what we've built here. Warren never understood that." Eleanor nodded, watching Henry graze peacefully in his paddock. The old donkey had become a local celebrity. Children would bring him carrots and tourists would stop to take pictures. But more importantly, he had become a symbol of something bigger. The idea that the things others dismiss as worthless might turn out to be the most valuable of all. That night, Eleanor sat in her new office, looking at the framed photo of her father on the desk. The community had found it in his old farmhouse and restored it for her. "I finally understand, Dad," she whispered. "You didn't just leave me a donkey. You left me a way to show people what really matters." Outside, the evening air was filled with the sounds of families working in their gardens, children playing, neighbors chatting. The simple, precious sounds of community. Eleanor didn't know it yet, but the biggest challenge and the most unexpected blessing was still to come. Because sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of an even bigger one. Year after Eleanor's confrontation with Warren, the town gathered for the grand opening of the Hayes Community Center. The old Thompson mansion, Warren's former home, had been converted into a hub for community programs, complete with teaching, gardens, a farmer's market, and educational spaces. "I still can't believe he sold it to the land trust," Victoria said, standing beside Eleanor as they watched people arrive for the celebration. Eleanor adjusted her oxygen tank. She still needed it, but not as much as before. "I think he didn't have much choice after the investigation. Warren had avoided jail time, but his empire had crumbled. The corruption investigation had revealed years of illegal dealings. In the end, he'd been forced to sell most of his properties at a fraction of their worth. He's in Florida now," Victoria mentioned. "Trying to start over. He sent me divorce papers last week." Eleanor squeezed her friend's hand. It still amazed her sometimes that Warren's wife had become one of her closest allies. The community center was packed. Families explored the teaching kitchen where cooking classes would be held. Children ran through the indoor garden where seniors would teach them about growing food. The walls were lined with photos showing the town's transformation over the past year. Henry had his own special place, a comfortable stable near the children's garden where he still helped with small plowing jobs and delighted visitors. Age was slowing him down, but like Eleanor, he had found new strength in purpose. "Ms. Hayes," a young reporter approached, "could we get a few words? People want to know what's next for the woman who changed everything." Eleanor smiled. "I'm not the one who changed things. We all did it together, but there was news to share. The Hayes Community Garden model was spreading. 5 other towns had started similar programs. Eleanor spent much of her time now advising other communities, showing them how to turn empty lots and backyard gardens into something magical. "The movie premieres next month," Jenny reminded her. A small production company had indeed made a film about their story, but on their terms, showing the truth about community, courage, and second chances. As Eleanor moved through the crowd, she kept hearing snippets of conversation that made her heart full. "The garden program helped my father after his stroke. My kids actually eat vegetables now. We've started a seed exchange program. Did you see the new therapy garden at the hospital?" Mrs. Johnson found her by the refreshment table. The older woman was using a walker now, but her eyes were bright as ever. "Someone's here to see you," she said with a mysterious smile. "In the main garden." Eleanor made her way outside, Henry following faithfully behind her. There, standing among the flowers and vegetables, was a familiar face, one she hadn't seen in decades. "Tommy Chen?" she gasped. "Her high school sweetheart?" Nodded. He had left town 30 years ago to become a doctor. "I saw the movie trailer," he said. "I couldn't believe it was you. I always knew you were special, Eleanor." Before Eleanor could respond, a commotion broke out near the center's entrance. To everyone's shock, Warren Aldridge himself stood there, looking older and much less imposing than he had a year ago. The crowd fell silent. Eleanor felt Tommy's supportive hand on her arm as she made her way over. Warren spoke first. "I'm not here to make trouble," he said quietly. I needed to understand." "Understand what?" Eleanor asked. "How you did it. How you beat me. I had all the money, all the power." Eleanor looked around at the community they'd built, the gardens, the people, the connections. "That was your mistake, Warren. You thought power only came from money, but there are stronger things." She led him through the center, showing him how his mansion had been transformed. Children waved from the learning garden, seniors taught cooking, classes in the kitchen, families gathered vegetables for dinner. "You tried to build an empire," Eleanor said gently. "We built a home." Warren left without another word, but Eleanor saw something different in his face. Not anger or bitterness, but maybe, just maybe, understanding. That evening, as the celebration wound down, Eleanor sat on a bench in the garden with Tommy, watching the sunset. Henry grazed nearby, his grey muzzle now almost white with age. "You know what today is?" Tommy asked. Eleanor nodded. 1 year since the confrontation with Warren. "But it's something else too." She looked at Henry. "It's exactly 2 years since I inherited a donkey that everyone thought was worthless," Tommy smiled. "And now look at all this." Eleanor took a deep breath, noticing how much easier it was these days. The garden air, the sense of purpose, the community support, it all helped. Her illness wasn't gone, but it no longer defined her. "Dad knew," she said softly. "He knew I'd need more than money to build something real. I needed a reminder that the most valuable things are the ones that money can't buy." As if understanding he was being talked about, Henry wandered over and rested his head on Eleanor's shoulder. Around them the garden bloomed with life. Vegetables ripening, flowers swaying in the breeze, the sound of children laughing in the distance. Eleanor Hayes, the sick woman everyone had pitied, was now one of the most respected people in town. But more importantly, she wasn't alone anymore. None of them were. "So," Tommy said, taking her hand, "what's next?" Eleanor smiled, looking out at the community they'd built, the lives they'd changed, the hope they'd planted. "We keep growing," she said simply. "One garden, one person, one dream at a time." And as the sun set on their little town, Eleanor knew that this wasn't really the end of her story. It was just the beginning of something even more beautiful. Because sometimes the smallest gifts, a donkey, a dream, a second chance, can grow into the biggest blessings of all. The end.